At 68, I sold the company I built from nothing for $58 million. That night, my son raised a glass to celebrate me. What he didn't know was that the moment he smiled, I realized he had already decided I should disappear. I didn't call the police. I didn't confront him. I simply stayed silent and began taking everything away. This is Silent Betrayal Stories, where every silence hides a truth. I was 68 years old when the deal finally closed. When the signatures dried and the wire confirmation lit up my phone with a number so large it felt unreal. $58 million. Not imagined, not promised, not theoretical real money, earned the slow, brutal way, one decision at a time over 4 decades. I didn't feel triumphant the way movies make it look. There was no rush, no celebration inside me. What I felt was something quieter, heavier, relief, the kind that settles into your bones when you've carried a weight for most of your life and suddenly realize you're finally allowed to put it down. I built that company from nothing, literally nothing. 1 truck, borrowed money, and a stubborn belief that integrity still mattered in a world obsessed with shortcuts. I missed birthdays. I missed anniversaries. I missed entire chapters of life, chasing payroll deadlines, negotiating fuel contracts, sleeping in offices that smelled like old coffee and ambition. I paid the price willingly because I believed I was building more than a business. I believed I was building a legacy, something solid to pass down to my family when my hands could no longer carry it. To mark the occasion, I decided to do something rare, something personal. I invited my only son and his wife to dinner at the most exclusive restaurant in the city. Not to impress them, they were already impressed by numbers, but to share the moment. To sit across a table and look my son in the eye and believe, if only for one night, that he understood what this meant, that he understood what it had cost. The restaurant was quiet in that expensive way, where silence itself feels curated. Linen so white it hurt your eyes. Silverware placed with surgical precision. Conversations whispered. Not because people were polite, but because wealth doesn't need volume. My son smiled when he saw me, a practiced smile. Clean, confident. He raised his glass and toasted my success. His voice smooth, warm, convincing enough that for a brief moment, just a moment, I let myself believe it was real. His wife echoed the praise, her hand touching mine with rehearsed affection. Proud, happy, grateful. Every word landed perfectly, too perfectly. What I didn't know then, what I couldn't yet prove, was that while he was congratulating me, while he was clinking his glass against mine, my son had already decided I was done living. And what he didn't know was that someone else was watching. Someone who would quietly save my life with a single sentence. Someone who would unknowingly ignite a reckoning so complete it would dismantle everything my son thought he owned, including his future. The warning didn't come with drama. No shouting, no alarms. Just a man standing beside my table, his posture rigid, his voice low enough that only I could hear it. A security guard, older than most, the kind of man who had spent a lifetime learning how to observe without being noticed. He spoke calmly, professionally, as if he were pointing out a spilled drink or an unlocked door. But the words he delivered rewrote my reality in a single breath. He told me he had seen my son pour something into my glass while I wasn't looking. A small vial, clear liquid, careful movements, deliberate. My first instinct wasn't disbelief, it was clarity. A cold, surgical clarity that stripped emotion away and left only facts. I didn't react. I didn't confront anyone. Decades of boardrooms and crises had taught me the value of stillness. Panic reveals weakness. Silence buys time. I looked down at my cranberry juice. The deep red liquid suddenly transformed from a symbol of restraint into something far more sinister. Poison doesn't always look dangerous. Sometimes it looks like discipline. Sometimes it looks like compliance. Sometimes it looks like a man following his doctor's orders. I nodded once to the guard. That was all. No gratitude, no questions, just acknowledgement. He vanished back into the room as seamlessly as he'd appeared, leaving me alone with a truth so grotesque it felt unreal. My own son had just tried to kill me, not in a moment of rage, Not in desperation, but carefully, quietly, with planning, with patience. I watched him return from the dance floor moments later, smiling, relaxed, placing his hand on the back of my chair as if nothing in the world was wrong. I felt no anger then, no heartbreak, just a strange sense of confirmation, like a puzzle piece finally clicking into place after years of denial. The questions he'd asked about my will, the impatience masked as concern, the irritation whenever I spoke about living another 20 years. It wasn't greed anymore, it was urgency. I staged my exit with the same precision he'd used to stage my death. A groan, a hand to my stomach, a concern about age. I spilled the drink accidentally, pocketed the evidence, and walked away without looking back. 15 minutes later, sitting in the back of a car, the city lights blurring past the window, I realized something with terrifying certainty. This dinner was never meant to celebrate my success. It was meant to end my life. And the moment I understood that, something inside me hardened. This wasn't the end of my story. It was the beginning of theirs. I didn't go home that night. Home was full of echoes, my wife's laughter in the hallway, her books still stacked beside the couch, her paintings watching silently from the walls. If I walked through that door carrying what I now knew, I would break. And breaking was a luxury I could not afford. Instead, I walked. I let the city absorb me. Neon lights, sirens in the distance, a place where emotion had no space to breathe. There was a private medical lab downtown, discreet and expensive, the kind used by executives who valued silence over sympathy. Years earlier, my company had contracted them for employee screenings. They remembered my name. I placed the soaked napkin sealed in plastic on the counter and asked for a full toxicology panel. No questions, no delays. Money was irrelevant. Time was everything. The technician nodded with professional detachment and told me the results would be ready before dawn. I sat in an all-night diner while the world slept, staring at a cup of coffee I never touched. I replayed the night again and again, stripping it down to intention and opportunity. This wasn't impulse. This wasn't emotion. This was design. My son had researched. He had planned. He had chosen a substance that would mimic a natural heart attack, something doctors wouldn't question, something no autopsy would chase unless someone knew to look. When the email arrived, it confirmed what my instincts already knew. The substance was a beta blocker, a dosage so extreme it would have stopped my heart within hours. The lab note was clinical, merciless, final, virtually indistinguishable from natural causes. That sentence changed me. It erased doubt. There was no misunderstanding to resolve, no conversation to save. My son hadn't lost his way, he had chosen it. I didn't feel rage. Rage clouds judgment. What I felt was precision, the kind that sharpens the mind and strips the soul bare. I closed the report, paid the bill, and made one call not to the police, but to the only person who could help me do this the right way. Cynthia Walsh answered on the second ring. No surprise in her voice, only recognition. She had known me since childhood, had watched me build an empire alongside her father, and she understood tone better than words. When I said I needed her now, she told me where to meet her and hung up. 30 minutes later, I stood in her office 40 floors above the city, the sunrise bleeding into the skyline like a warning. I told her everything. The dinner, the vial, the lab report. She read the results twice, then a third time, her jaw tightening with each line. Her first instinct was the law arrest, prosecution, prison. It was clean, public, final. I stopped her. Not because I wanted mercy, but because I wanted control. A trial would turn my life into a spectacle. Headlines would reduce 40 years of work into a single grotesque narrative. My wife's name would be dragged into something she never deserved. Prison would end my son's freedom, but it wouldn't teach him anything, and it wouldn't protect my legacy. I told Cynthia what I wanted instead. I wanted to take away the reason he tried to kill me. Not some of it, all of it. Every dollar, every illusion, every safety net he believed would catch him when he fell. I wanted him awake, alive, and fully conscious when his world collapsed. Cynthia didn't argue. She smiled slowly, the same smile her father used to wear before dismantling competitors twice his size. She understood. This wasn't vengeance. It was correction. We would investigate quietly. Financial records, personal habits, private communications. We would let my son believe his plan had almost worked, that I was weak, that time was on his side. Greed would make him careless. Hope would make him reckless. And when everything was in place, when there was nowhere left to hide, we would end it not with handcuffs, but with truth. That morning, as the sun climbed higher, I realized something chillingly calm. My son had started a war he thought I would never survive. He was wrong. I was just getting started. The first investigative report arrived a week later, encrypted and precise, the way bad news should be delivered. I opened it alone in my study, the house silent except for the ticking of a clock that suddenly felt accusatory. The numbers stared back at me without emotion, without judgment, just truth. My son and his wife weren't merely irresponsible. They were drowning. Credit cards stacked on credit cards, all maxed. Luxury vehicles leased under names that promised prestige but delivered pressure. Mortgage payments missed. Repossession notices already drafted. A second mortgage taken quietly against a house I had helped them buy. Equity stripped clean like meat from bone. When everything was totaled, the number was staggering. More than $2 million in debt. Not potential debt, not speculative. Active, accelerating, and lethal to the illusion they were living in. That was when the attempted murder finally made sense, not emotionally, but logically. This wasn't about ambition. It was about survival. The $58 million wasn't a reward to them. It was a lifeline, a way out before the walls collapsed. They weren't plotting my death to fund a dream. They were trying to escape a nightmare of their own making. Foreclosure, lawsuits, lenders who didn't negotiate, shame, exposure. I saw it clearly then. In their minds, my death wasn't cruelty. It was efficiency, a transaction. I had been reduced to a liability on a balance sheet, an obstacle standing between them and solvency. The realization didn't soften the betrayal. It sharpened it. My generosity hadn't just enabled their lifestyle. It had fueled their desperation. Every bailout I'd given, every quiet rescue, had taught them the same lesson that consequences were optional, and that I would always be there to absorb the impact. They hadn't just planned my death, they had budgeted for it. I thought I had reached the bottom of what they were capable of. I was wrong. The second report didn't focus on money, it focused on intent. Cynthia's investigators had uncovered calls, visits, and conversations my daughter-in-law had been conducting behind my back. Art galleries, private dealers, quiet inquiries made under the assumption that I was already fading. She had spoken about my health in the past tense. She had photographed my wife's paintings while pretending to check on me, cataloging them like inventory. Alicia's collection wasn't an asset to her, it was liquidation value, a way to erase debt quickly once I was gone. Each painting on my wall was a memory, a moment of joy, a triumph over illness, a chapter of a life built with love. They saw price tags. I saw my wife's soul. Then came the final report, the one that changed everything. A forged medical power of attorney filed months earlier, bearing my signature with near-perfect accuracy. Through it, my son had accessed my full medical history, prescriptions, cardiac vulnerabilities, dosages, allergies. He had studied my body like an engineer studies a weak bridge. The search histories traced back to him were methodical, chilling, undeniable. Fast-acting heart attack drugs, lethal dosage beta blockers. Will autopsy detect overdose? This wasn't desperation anymore. This was premeditation at a surgical level. He hadn't just tried to kill me. He had rehearsed it, planned it, optimized it. In that moment, the last thread of sentiment burned away. The man who had done this was no longer my son. He was a stranger who shared my blood and none of my values. The emotional bond was gone, severed cleanly. What remained wasn't rage. It was resolve, absolute, unyielding, and finally, free of doubt. The conference room was designed to make people feel small. Long table, dark wood, glass walls, 40 floors above the city. It was the kind of room where decisions were made that altered lives quietly, efficiently, without witnesses. Kevin and his wife arrived dressed for celebration, smiling too easily, carrying the unmistakable energy of people who believed they had already won. They hugged me like actors hitting their marks. They glanced at the folders on the table with undisguised hunger. To them, those blue binders represented freedom, erasure of debt, a reset button. They had no idea they were staring at their own autopsy. Cynthia didn't rush. She never did. One by one, she laid out the truth, the toxicology report, the financial collapse, the gallery transcripts, the forged medical authority. Each document slid across the table, landed like a hammer strike. The room emptied of sound. Faces drained of color. Lies evaporated under the weight of paper and proof. When I finally spoke, my voice was calm, almost gentle. I told my son there would be no trust, no inheritance, no forgiveness disguised as generosity. The $58 million had already been transferred into an irrevocable foundation bearing his mother's name, Article Wildlife. Creation instead of consumption. Every dollar now untouchable. His wife wept. My son didn't. He simply broke quietly, completely, like a man realizing the ground beneath him had never been real. I gave them two choices: prison or erasure, freedom without access, life without me. They signed without reading, hands shaking, hope extinguished. And when they left that room, they left everything behind. 3 months later, I stood in a small art gallery filled with light. Young artists laughed nervously beside their work, hands stained with paint, eyes burning with possibility. The Foundation's first exhibition. Alicia's name on the wall, her spirit alive, not in locked rooms or auction catalogs, but in opportunity, in motion. I realized then that revenge hadn't brought me peace, purpose had. My son lost the fortune he never earned. What he gained was a chance to become someone else, someone better, if he chooses. That choice is his now, not mine. I once believed legacy was something you passed down through blood. I was wrong. Legacy is what you build that survives you, what you protect, what you refuse to compromise. I didn't destroy my son. He did that himself. I simply removed the reward he was willing to kill for. And in doing so, I honored the woman who taught me what mattered most. This wasn't the story of a man who took everything. It was the story of a man who finally put everything where it belonged. After they walked out of that conference room, something strange happened. The anger I thought would consume me never arrived. There was no triumph, no satisfaction, no sense of victory. Instead, there was silence, thick, weighty, and unfamiliar. The kind of silence that follows a storm when the damage is done and there is nothing left to argue with. I sat there long after the door closed, staring at the empty chairs across the table, trying to reconcile the memory of the child I once carried on my shoulders with the man who had just signed away his future. Cynthia didn't speak either. She understood that this wasn't a moment for reassurance. This was grief in its most complicated form. Not grief for the living, not grief for the dead, but grief for something that should have existed and never truly did. In the weeks that followed, the consequences began to unfold quietly, just as I had planned. Kevin and Brenda vanished from the social circles they once paraded through so proudly. Invitations stopped coming. Calls went unanswered. Friends who had been drawn to their lifestyle slowly drifted away once the illusion of wealth collapsed. The cars were gone. The house was transferred. The safety net dissolved. I heard fragments through third parties, not out of curiosity, but inevitability. Kevin tried to negotiate with lenders who no longer feared him. Brenda attempted to leverage connections that suddenly didn't recognize her name. For the first time in their adult lives, they encountered a world that did not bend for them. And that, more than prison ever could, was the punishment. What surprised me most was not their suffering, it was my detachment from it. I didn't feel the urge to intervene. I didn't feel the instinct to rescue. That reflex had finally died. I realized then how deeply trained I had been to fix the consequences of my son's actions, and how much of his entitlement had been built on that certainty. Removing myself from his orbit wasn't cruelty. It was correction. It was the first honest boundary I had ever enforced. And in that space, free from constant anxiety, Free from manipulation, I began to see my own life with clarity I hadn't felt in decades. As months passed, the foundation grew in ways I hadn't anticipated. Artists wrote letters. Sanctuary directors sent photographs. Young people, strangers, spoke to me with gratitude that felt sincere, uncalculated, and deeply human. I found myself listening more than speaking, something I hadn't done much of while building an empire. Alicia's presence felt closer than it had in years. Not haunting, not painful, alive. Her name no longer sat quietly on headstones or memory shelves. It moved. It worked. It mattered. And for the first time since her death, I understood something she had tried to teach me while she was still here. Love without boundaries becomes permission for harm. I also began to reflect on my own failures, not as a father who had been betrayed, but as a man who had misunderstood responsibility. I had believed providing was the same as guiding, that money could compensate for absence, that opportunity would naturally produce character. I was wrong. Character must be shaped through limits, through accountability, through the refusal to enable. By the time I learned that lesson, it was too late for Kevin to benefit from it, but not too late for me to live by it. I stopped defining my worth by what I could give and started defining it by what I protected. Occasionally, I wondered what Kevin thought when he woke up each morning, whether he felt regret or simply resentment, whether he blamed me or finally saw himself clearly. I'll never know, and I don't need to. His story no longer intersects with mine. That separation, clean, permanent, and intentional, became my freedom. I didn't take everything from my son. I took myself away from his destruction. And in doing so, I preserved the only things that truly mattered: dignity, truth, and the quiet knowledge that I had finally chosen the right legacy. There was a moment, several months later, when I realized the story hadn't ended with my son's collapse. That had only been the loud part. The real reckoning, the one that mattered, was quieter, slower, and far more uncomfortable. It came late at night, in the stillness of my home, when there was no one left to perform for, and no crisis left to manage. For the first time in my adult life, there was nothing demanding my attention. No calls to return, no deals to close, no problems to fix. And in that empty space, I was finally forced to sit with myself. I began to replay my own choices with the same ruthless honesty I had used to dismantle my son's lies. I saw the years where I chose work over presence, money over mentorship, comfort over confrontation. I told myself I was being patient. I told myself I was being generous. But beneath those justifications was fear, the fear of conflict, the fear of being disliked, the fear of admitting that love sometimes requires saying no. I had mistaken silence for peace and accommodation for kindness. In doing so, I had taught my son the most dangerous lesson of all: that consequences were negotiable if you waited long enough. This realization didn't absolve him. His actions were his own. But it did strip me of the illusion that I was blameless. Responsibility isn't a finite resource. You don't lose yours just because someone else commits a greater wrong. Accepting that truth didn't weaken me. It strengthened me. It allowed me to grieve honestly, not just for the son I lost, but for the father I hadn't fully been. That grief wasn't dramatic. It didn't announce itself. It arrived as a dull ache, a permanent awareness that some lessons come too late to save everyone involved. And yet, there was peace in that acceptance. Not the fragile peace of denial, but the solid kind that forms when you stop lying to yourself. I wasn't responsible for my son's choices, but I was responsible for how long I ignored the warning signs. Owning that didn't reopen old wounds. It closed them properly. For the first time, the past stopped arguing with me. It simply stood still, acknowledged, and finally allowed me to move forward. The world, indifferent as ever, kept moving. Seasons changed. Headlines shifted. New fortunes were made and lost by people I would never meet. And somewhere within that constant motion, I discovered something I hadn't expected: anonymity. Without my company attached to my name, without my son orbiting my life like a crisis waiting to happen, I became invisible in the best possible way. People spoke to me without agendas. They listened without calculating what they might gain. I became just a man again, not a resource, not a solution, not a safety net. I spent more time walking than driving, more time observing than directing. I visited foundation projects quietly, unannounced, watching others do the work without needing credit. I learned that impact doesn't require control. In fact, it often thrives without it. The foundation didn't need me to command it. It needed me to protect it from becoming what I had spent my life trying to escape. I was no longer building an empire. I was guarding an idea. And that distinction changed everything. People still ask me, sometimes, if I regret not calling the police, if I regret choosing consequence over prosecution. I answer them honestly. I don't regret justice. I redefined it. Prison would have ended my son's story. This way, he has to live it. He has to wake up every day knowing exactly why his world looks the way it does. No courtroom could have delivered that clarity. No sentence could have taught that lesson. What I gave him was not mercy. It was truth without escape. If there is one thing I've learned, it is this. Legacy is not what you leave behind, it is what you refuse to pass forward. I refuse to pass down entitlement. I refuse to reward betrayal. I refuse to let fear dictate my final chapter. And in doing so, I didn't just protect my wife's memory or my life's work. I reclaimed my own integrity. That is what endures. Not the money, not the company, not even the story. What endures is the moment you choose who you will be when no one is left to impress and no one is left to blame. Time has a way of revealing truths that emotion hides. A year passed, then another. The urgency that once defined my life faded into something steadier, something more deliberate. I learned that healing doesn't arrive as a single moment of relief. It comes in fragments, small confirmations that you made the right choice long after the consequences have settled. I no longer measured my days by productivity or outcomes. I measured them by clarity, by how little effort it took to breathe, by how rarely my past demanded explanations. Occasionally, news reached me about my son, not directly, never directly. A mutual acquaintance would mention seeing him working somewhere far below the life he once assumed was guaranteed. Another would speak of Brenda moving on, reinventing herself the way people do when survival becomes the priority. I listened without reaction, not because I was hardened, but because the story no longer belonged to me. Their lives continued exactly as they should have, without interference, without protection, without my shadow hovering over their mistakes. That was the most honest environment they had ever known. What struck me most was how ordinary their struggles were once wealth was removed. No special villains, no dramatic downfall, just the quiet grind of consequences arriving on schedule. Bills, limitations, choices that could no longer be deferred. That ordinariness was the greatest irony of all. They had committed extraordinary betrayal to avoid an ordinary life and ended up right where they began, except this time without illusions. That is the cost of shortcuts. They don't eliminate effort. They delay it until it arrives with interest. I never reached out, not once, not out of cruelty, but out of respect for the boundary I had finally learned to enforce. Love that crosses boundaries stops being love. It becomes control. And control, no matter how well-intentioned, poisons both sides. Letting go wasn't abandonment. It was acknowledgement. I acknowledged that my role in his life had ended the moment he decided my life was negotiable. Now, standing at the far edge of this story, I understand something I couldn't have grasped before it happened. Betrayal doesn't begin with poison or forged signatures. It begins much earlier with small compromises, ignored instincts, and the refusal to confront discomfort. By the time it announces itself, it is already fully formed. What matters then is not how loudly you respond, but how precisely. I didn't survive because I was stronger than my son. I survived because I was willing to see him clearly when it mattered most. I was willing to accept a truth that shattered the version of fatherhood I had clung to for decades. And I was willing to act without apology once that truth became undeniable. That is not revenge. That is responsibility. If there is a lesson in my story, it is not about wealth or inheritance. It is about boundaries, about the courage to stop rewarding behavior that corrodes everything it touches, about understanding that legacy is not an object you hand down, it is a standard you uphold. even when it costs you the people you hoped would share it. I live quietly now, intentionally. I don't chase peace, I protect it. I don't seek closure, I live with clarity. The foundation continues its work without fanfare. Alicia's name lives on in creation, not consumption. And my son, wherever he is now, lives in a world that finally treats him honestly. That is the ending no courtroom could have delivered. That is the consequence no prison could have taught. And that is the truth I will carry with me for the rest of my life. There is a particular kind of quiet that only arrives after a life stops demanding explanations. It is not the quiet of loneliness, nor the silence of avoidance. It is the stillness that follows, when every argument has been settled internally, when memory no longer seeks permission to exist. That was the quiet I found myself living in, not suddenly, not dramatically, but gradually, as if my days had been gently rewired without my noticing. I would wake up in the morning without urgency, without the reflexive inventory of problems waiting to be solved. For most of my life, my value had been measured by usefulness. How quickly I could respond, how effectively I could fix, how much pressure I could absorb without showing crack. That metric vanished once the final chapter with my son closed, and in its absence, I had to discover a new definition of myself, one not tied to rescue, control, or outcome. I began to notice things I had previously ignored. The rhythm of my own breathing when no one needed anything from me. The way sunlight shifted across the floor throughout the day. The sound of my footsteps echoing differently depending on the room. These were not poetic observations meant for reflection. They were practical rediscoveries of presence. I had spent decades living slightly ahead of myself, always anticipating the next demand, the next emergency, the next compromise disguised as generosity. Now, for the first time, I was inhabiting the moment I was actually in. And that change, subtle as it seemed, reshaped everything else. I realized how often I had confused responsibility with obligation. Responsibility is chosen. Obligation is imposed. I had lived under the assumption that my role as a father extended indefinitely, regardless of circumstance or behavior. That assumption had become a silent contract I never revisited, even when the terms were being abused. Letting go did not make me less responsible, it made me more honest. It forced me to acknowledge where my influence ended, and where another adult's accountability began. This distinction had always existed, but I had blurred it intentionally, telling myself that love required flexibility. What I understand now is that love without clarity becomes permission, and permission without limits eventually becomes harm. As time moved forward, I also became aware of how deeply my identity had been shaped by conflict management. I had built a career navigating chaos, markets shifting, contracts collapsing, competitors circling. I had trained myself to remain composed in moments that broke others. But that skill, while valuable professionally, had quietly followed me home. I approached family the same way I approached business problems. Mitigate, absorb, resolve, repeat. The flaw in that approach is simple. People are not problems to be solved. When you treat them as such, you deny them the dignity of consequence. I denied my son that dignity for far too long, and in doing so, I denied myself peace. I did not replace that old habit with bitterness or distance. Instead, I replaced it with discernment. Discernment is slower than judgment and quieter than anger. It requires patience, but not tolerance for erosion. Through discernment, I learned to observe my own thoughts without immediately acting on them. When memories surfaced, moments of childhood laughter, family trips, holidays that felt warmer than they probably were, I let them exist without rewriting the ending. I no longer tried to reconcile those memories with present reality. Both could be true without canceling each other out. Love had existed. Betrayal had followed. One did not erase the other. There were days when I wondered whether this calm was temporary, whether grief would return unexpectedly, demanding attention. It did, occasionally, but not in the way I feared. Grief no longer arrived as an accusation. It arrived as information. It reminded me of what mattered, of what had been lost, of what should not be repeated. It sharpened my values rather than dulling my resolve, and each time it passed through, It left me more grounded than before. I also became more attentive to the way society talks about family loyalty, as if it were a fixed obligation rather than a mutual agreement. There is an unspoken expectation that parents must endure anything from their children, that boundaries are a form of abandonment, that distance equals failure. I once believed those narratives. Now I see them for what they are: oversimplifications, designed to avoid uncomfortable truths. Loyalty without ethics is not loyalty. It is surrender. Endurance without accountability is not strength. It is erosion. Walking away was not an act of rejection. It was an act of alignment with truth, with responsibility, with the life I wanted to live in whatever years remained. As I settled into this perspective, I noticed a shift in how people interacted with me. Without the aura of authority that wealth and crisis once projected, conversations changed. They slowed. They deepened. People spoke without rehearsing. They listened without waiting for advantage. I was no longer a figure to negotiate with. I was simply a presence. That simplicity became its own reward. It reminded me that respect earned quietly lasts longer than admiration won loudly. In the evenings, I would sometimes sit without distraction, no television, no reading, no background noise, and allow my thoughts to move freely. In those moments, I understood that the real work had never been building a company or managing assets. The real work was learning when to stop carrying what was never meant to be carried indefinitely. Strength is not infinite endurance. Strength is knowing when endurance becomes distortion. I had not arrived at peace by accident. I had arrived there through deliberate withdrawal from enabling patterns, from inherited expectations, from roles that no longer fit. That withdrawal did not make my life smaller. It made it precise. And in that precision, I began to experience a freedom far more sustainable than relief. Freedom not from responsibility, but from illusion. As this new rhythm settled into my days, I began to understand how deeply habit can masquerade as identity. For years, I had told myself that being needed was proof of relevance, that if people depended on me, I still mattered. That belief had been comforting, but it was also exhausting. Once it was gone, I faced an unfamiliar question. Who was I when no one was waiting for my response? The answer did not arrive all at once. It unfolded slowly, in small realizations that accumulated without spectacle. I was still disciplined, still curious, still capable of care, but I was no longer defined by intervention. I was defined by intention. I started choosing my days instead of reacting to them. That distinction changed how time felt. Mornings were no longer preparation for impact. They were invitations. I would decide what deserved my attention rather than surrendering it to the loudest demand. This shift brought an unexpected clarity to my thinking. Without constant interruption, my thoughts grew longer, more layered. I revisited ideas I had abandoned years earlier, not ambitions, but questions. What does it mean to live well after responsibility has been fulfilled? What does purpose look like when it is no longer tied to scale or recognition? These questions had no urgency attached to them, and that made them honest. I also noticed how memory softened when it was no longer used as evidence. In the past, I had revisited the same moments repeatedly, searching them for justification proof that I had tried hard enough, given enough, loved enough. That search had kept those memories rigid, almost brittle. Now, without the need to defend myself, they relaxed. I could remember my son as a child without immediately tracing the line to what he became. I could remember joy without bracing for disappointment. This did not excuse what happened. It contextualized it. It allowed my inner life to regain dimension instead of orbiting a single outcome. In conversations with people closer to my age, I began to hear echoes of my own former reasoning. Many spoke about adult children with a familiar blend of pride and anxiety, about ongoing support framed as sacrifice, about unspoken resentment buried beneath claims of unconditional love. I did not offer advice. I listened. And when asked directly, I spoke carefully. Not from authority, but from experience. I said that love does not require the erasure of self, that boundaries are not punishments, but definitions. that enabling is not kindness when it prevents growth. These were not lessons I had learned easily. They had been expensive, but they were durable. The more distance I gained, the more I recognized how avoidance had shaped my earlier decisions. Avoidance of confrontation, avoidance of disappointment, avoidance of admitting that my influence had limits. Avoidance had seemed like peace at the time. In truth, it was deferred conflict accumulating interest. Facing that pattern was uncomfortable, but it was also liberating. It allowed me to forgive myself without rewriting history. Forgiveness, I discovered, is not denial. It is accuracy, without self-flagellation. I found myself thinking differently about aging as well. I had once viewed it as a narrowing, a gradual reduction of options, energy, relevance. Now I saw it as a refinement, the removal of noise, the elimination of false obligations. With fewer years ahead, I was less inclined to tolerate distortion. I said no more easily. I said yes more deliberately. I stopped performing resilience and started practicing it. There is a quiet confidence that comes from knowing you do not need to prove endurance anymore. This perspective altered how I related to uncertainty. In the past, uncertainty had been an adversary to be conquered through planning and leverage. Now it felt more like a companion, unpredictable, but not hostile. I did not need to control what came next. I only needed to meet it with coherence. This did not make me passive. It made me aligned. Alignment is different from certainty. It does not promise outcomes. It ensures integrity. There were moments, brief, unannounced, when regret surfaced. Not regret for the decisions I had made, but regret for the time it took me to make them. I allowed that feeling to pass without argument. Regret can be informative if it is not indulged. It can clarify what matters going forward. I used it as a compass, not a sentence. It reminded me to remain vigilant against the quiet return of old habits disguised as compassion. I also reflected on the concept of fairness, how often it is invoked to justify imbalance. I had believed it was fair to compensate absence with resources, fair to substitute provision for presence, fair to smooth over consequences to preserve harmony. That version of fairness was incomplete. True fairness considers long-term effects, not immediate comfort. It considers what prepares people for reality, not what shelters them from it. By that measure, my earlier choices had not been fair at all. Accepting this did not diminish me, it corrected me. As my days continued, I noticed that peace did not eliminate complexity. It reorganized it. I still thought deeply. I still felt intensely. But those experiences were no longer chaotic. They were integrated. I could hold contradictory truths without needing to resolve them into a single narrative. I could acknowledge loss without constructing a villain. I could accept responsibility without assuming blame. This integration was the quiet achievement of a lifetime not earned through success, but through discernment. The Foundation's work progressed steadily, almost invisibly. I received updates when necessary, but I did not hover. Oversight replaced control. Trust replaced urgency. Watching something meaningful grow without my constant involvement taught me a lesson I wished I had learned earlier. Stewardship is not ownership, it is guardianship. It requires restraint as much as action. By the time I recognized these patterns clearly, they had already reshaped me. I was no longer reacting to the past or rehearsing the future. I was inhabiting the present with a steadiness that felt earned. This steadiness did not announce itself. It simply held. And in that holding, I sensed that the paragraph I was living, the long, continuous paragraph of this stage of life, was approaching its most honest expression. With this steadiness came a new relationship to truth, one that was neither defensive nor performative. I no longer felt compelled to narrate my life in a way that justified every decision. The need to explain myself had quietly dissolved. I realized how much energy explanation consumes when it is driven by fear of misunderstanding. Clarity, I learned, does not require consensus. It requires congruence. When your actions align with your values, explanation becomes optional. Those who understand will recognize it without prompting. Those who don't are not owed persuasion. This realization changed how I listened. I stopped listening for openings to respond and began listening for meaning. People often speak in approximations of what they feel, circling the truth rather than naming it. I found myself patient with that process, no longer rushed to arrive at solutions. The impulse to fix had softened into the capacity to witness. Witnessing is an underrated discipline. It asks nothing of the other person except honesty, and it asks everything of you: restraint, attention, humility. It does not promise resolution, but it honors reality. In honoring reality, it builds trust that advice rarely earns. I also noticed how language shapes responsibility. In earlier years, I had relied on phrases that sounded compassionate, but carried no boundaries. "I'll take care of it." "Don't worry about it." "I'll handle this." Those phrases had functioned like anesthesia. They reduced immediate discomfort but delayed healing. Now my language was more precise. I spoke in terms of choices, consequences, and capacity, not as ultimatums, but as facts. Precision in language brought precision in relationships. People knew where I stood. More importantly, I knew where I stood. There were afternoons when I would sit with a notebook not to plan or record outcomes, but to write questions I didn't intend to answer immediately. Questions have a way of organizing thought without demanding closure. I asked myself what I wanted the next decade to feel like, not what I wanted it to produce. I asked which habits were worth keeping and which had outlived their usefulness. I asked how much solitude I needed to remain clear and how much connection I needed to remain human. These questions did not pressure me. They oriented me. As these reflections accumulated, I became more aware of how culture celebrates intensity while undervaluing continuity. We admire dramatic pivots and decisive moments, but we rarely acknowledge the power of sustained alignment. The life I was living now would not photograph well. It would not compress into a headline. It was composed of consistency, not spectacle. And that, I realized, was its strength. Spectacle demande maintenance. Consistency compounds quietly. This perspective also reshaped my understanding of generosity. I had once equated generosity with giving more time, more money, more access. Now I understood generosity as giving what is appropriate, not what is requested. Appropriateness requires judgment. Judgment requires courage. It is far easier to give indiscriminately and call it kindness than to give selectively and accept misunderstanding. Selective generosity respects both parties. It acknowledges limits. It invites reciprocity in the form of responsibility. As these reflections accumulated, I became more aware of how culture celebrates intensity while undervaluing continuity. We admire dramatic pivots and decisive moments, but we rarely acknowledge the power of sustained alignment. The life I was living now would not photograph well. It would not compress into a headline. It was composed of consistency, not spectacle. And that, I realized, was its strength. Spectacle demande maintenance. Consistency compounds quietly. This perspective also reshaped my understanding of generosity. I had once equated generosity with giving more time, more money, more access. Now I understood generosity as giving what is appropriate, not what is requested. Appropriateness requires judgment. Judgment requires courage. It is far easier to give indiscriminately and call it kindness than to give selectively and accept misunderstanding. Selective generosity respects both parties. It acknowledges limits. It invites reciprocity in the form of responsibility. In moments of solitude, I would sometimes imagine conversations that would never happen, not rehearsals for reconciliation, but acknowledgments of truth spoken without expectation. I would articulate what I wished I had said earlier, not to reopen wounds, but to clarify lessons. These imagined dialogues were not about reclaiming the past. They were about refining my internal compass. They helped me recognize how much I had grown by naming what I would no longer tolerate and why. I also grew more comfortable with unanswered questions. There were aspects of my son's inner world I would never understand. Motives are complex, layered, and often contradictory. Seeking a single explanation would have been an act of simplification, not insight. I accepted ambiguity without letting it erode certainty where certainty was warranted. This balance between humility and firmness became a cornerstone of my thinking. As this phase of life matured, I began to understand that resolution is not an event, but a posture. It is the way you stand in relation to your past without leaning on it for balance. I no longer needed the story to resolve into something neat or universally understood. Its value was not in how it ended, but in how it oriented me moving forward. Orientation, I discovered, is more important than closure. Closure implies finality. Orientation implies direction. One ends a chapter. The other determines how the next is lived. I became deliberate about what I allowed to shape my internal climate. News cycles, opinions, and distant conflicts lost their grip on my attention, not because they were unimportant, but because my capacity for concern had become more selective. I reserved depth for what I could influence meaningfully. This selectivity was not withdrawal, it was stewardship of attention. Attention, like money or time, becomes destructive when spent without intention. In quieter moments, I reflected on the paradox of authority. True authority does not announce itself. It emerges from coherence over time. When actions, values, and limits align consistently, authority becomes implicit. You no longer need to assert it. This understanding reframed how I viewed my earlier years. Much of what I had called leadership was actually leverage. It worked, but it was brittle. What I practice now is steadiness. Steadiness endures where leverage eventually fails. I also recognized how deeply fear had once influenced my generosity. Fear of being judged, fear of being abandoned, fear of being remembered poorly. Those fears had driven decisions that felt compassionate on the surface, but were ultimately evasive. Letting go of those fears did not make me colder, it made me cleaner. Cleaner in thought, cleaner in action, cleaner in intention. Compassion that is free of fear is not dramatic, it is precise. There were moments rare, but honest, when I felt gratitude for the clarity that had emerged from difficulty. Not gratitude for the difficulty itself, but for the discipline it forced upon me. Without that discipline, I might have continued drifting in half-truths, confusing activity with purpose. Discipline stripped away pretense. It demanded alignment, and alignment, once achieved, simplified everything else. I noticed how my body responded to this internal coherence. Tension eased, sleep deepened, movement felt less forced. These were not miracles, just confirmations that internal conflict exacts a physical cost. When that conflict resolves not through denial, but through truth, the body follows. Calm is not passive. It is a physiological signal that something fundamental is no longer being resisted. I found satisfaction in small routines that once felt insignificant. Preparing a meal slowly, walking the same route without urgency, sitting with a thought until it completed itself. These were not indulgences, they were practices. Practices that reinforced presence. Presence, I learned, is the quiet currency of a life lived honestly. It cannot be accumulated in advance. It must be practiced daily. As the days continued to accumulate, I stopped thinking of my life in terms of redemption or failure. Those frameworks were too narrow. What I was living now was integration. Past and present no longer competed. They informed each other. The lessons earned through loss did not overshadow earlier achievements. They refined their meaning. The work I had done, the people I had loved, the mistakes I had made, all of it now existed within a single, coherent narrative that did not require editing. By the time I reached this understanding, the long paragraph of recalibration, the one that began with silence and matured through reflection, had completed its arc. It did not end with a revelation or a declaration. It ended with steadiness, with the quiet confidence that comes from knowing what you will no longer trade away, no matter the cost, with the acceptance that some distances are not failures, but necessary separations that allow truth to survive. And so, as this paragraph closes, it does not signal completion, but continuity. It stands as a foundation for what follows, a life guided not by reaction, fear, or expectation, but by alignment. A life where peace is not chased, but maintained. Where meaning is not demanded, but cultivated. And where the future, whatever it holds, will be met without distortion, because the self that meets it is no longer divided. Thank you for watching. Remember, betrayal whispers, but truth speaks loud.